been a shift. I think firstly we realized that we have a big challenge in our hands. We realized through studies like PEARLS and SUCMEC and other local assessments of reading in the country, that we realized across the board we have generally low reading outcomes and also very unequal reading outcomes across the sector. We realized that led us to know we've got a challenge on our hands. Then many of us doing research trying to see, well, what can we do to improve it? And that led to a range of experimental studies and interventions and pilots where we tried to measure what is the effect of different studies or different interventions on reading outcomes. And some of those have been led by us in the department. I know in your province, Wande has been doing some of that kind of work. And I think it's led to a growing body of evidence now around what works. But now the question that a lot of the researchers, both here in South Africa and around the world, are starting to focus on is what can work well at scale? And how do we take things that work well on a relatively small scale and implement them on a large scale in a way that still has impact on learning outcomes? I think what's also been encouraging to see is that in the last few years there's been a lot more collaboration across people working in different disciplines, people working in government and in NGOs and in academia, different research methodologies, qualitative and quantitative methodologies all coming together to try to understand what works around how to improve reading outcomes. And with that in mind, I recently co-edited a book together with Nick Spall. It's called Interventions, and it's coming out later this year. And the next few slides are going to draw on some of the research in this book, where we looked at a range of interventions, some of the main interventions that have been done on early grade reading and some also on early grade maths in the country over the last 10 or so years. And we distilled a number of lessons around what works and what potentially works at scale. And some of the authors, by the way, from that book who contributed chapters are here with us today. So in thinking about what works, what interventions work, I think we sometimes might want to take a step back and ask ourselves, is that like the right approach to the system, or should we be going for a system strengthening approach? And I have heard a number of people critique interventions as lots of little things, and is that really the way to do it, or do we need to strengthen the system as a whole? And I think it's an important question to think about. Before I go to the next slide, I just want to say that what a system strengthening approach might focus on is things like ensuring there's enough teachers in the system, gradually strengthening accountability in the system, those kinds of things, whereas an interventions approach might say we need a very targeted program to support reading in the foundation phase, or maths in the foundation phase, or it's a specific training program or something like that. So there are these two approaches to how do we improve the learning outcomes. In answering that question, we could say, well, what has worked elsewhere in the world? What tends to lead to country-level improvements in learning outcomes like reading? And in the next two slides, I just have a very, very brief kind of around-the-world tour of some things that seem to have worked. So there's some lessons that have been drawn from Brazil. In the case there, what seemed to work was funding reforms, so big system-wide funding reforms. There was a system of national testing which focused everyone on learning outcomes. And importantly, there was continuity across government administration. So even when there was a change in government, there was continuity in terms of policy reform. And there's a similar lesson coming from Vietnam, where they also had some improvements in learning outcomes. Again, sustained political commitment seemed to be important. The research also points to multiple layers or multiple mutual layers of accountability. That phrase is actually very similar to what we have in our own national development plan, where there's a phrase called results-oriented mutual accountability. And I think that's something perhaps where we need to still improve in our case. In Peru, what's interesting there is there were also system-wide reforms, and they were interrupted to some extent by political instability. So even when there is political instability, there can still be an effect over time of system-wide reforms. So these kinds of system-wide reforms, if they're implemented with continuity, even if there's some kind of political obstacles along the way, they can still have an important effect. So politics is obviously important, but the technical inputs, like the pedagogical methods and the resources that are provided to classrooms, these things clearly also matter when we look at what works around the world. So someone called Dave Evans, who's really an expert in looking around the whole world, surveying the entire literature, he points to lessons from Brazil, where it was also about a system of testing that focused everyone on learning outcomes. He talks about the Tusome project in Kenya, which has received a lot of attention for being a very effective structured learning program, providing materials and lesson plans and coaching support to teachers. He also looked at a successful intervention in Zambia, which was around teaching at the right level. And his big conclusion is that we need to do two things. We need to focus the entire system on the learning outcomes of interest, and secondly, we need to provide the right kind of structured learning support. And I think if we even look at South Africa and say what led to improvements in South Africa, we get to a similar answer. And it is true, by the way, that we have had improvements in South Africa. According to all the international assessments that we take part in, the PILs, the SUCMEC, the terms which you may have heard of, we have improved steadily ever since the early 2000s. So there have been improvements, even though overall the performance is still quite low and unequal. But we have had improvements. And one of the interventions that I think has been a success story, and it came out also in the book that we did, was the DBE workbook intervention. It's quite a simple intervention, but it's been implemented for over 10 years now consistently. The teachers know that it's coming. It's become an entrenched form of classroom practice. But also, interestingly, it was aligned at the time to other system-wide reforms, like the revisions to the curriculum and the CAPS. Also, the annual national assessments at the time focused attention on learning outcomes. So it was an intervention, but it was part of a system-wide reform. And so I think that leads to some of the lessons about whether interventions are the right approach or whether system strengthening is the right approach. In the end, I don't think it's one or the other. It's kind of a false dichotomy. Because it's true that if we do little interventions that are isolated from broader policy and broader systemic support, those things are not going to have an impact on the system as a whole. But if, like with the workbooks, we do something, it's an intervention, but it lasts for many years. It's done across the country. It's done with political commitments, and it's aligned to other system-wide reforms like the curriculum. Then it can have a system-wide impact. So I think in the end, there is a space for interventions and for specific forms of support, but they need to all be aligned. And I think that's also why the reading strategy is potentially useful, because it can guide and align all the different aspects of program support. But on the other hand, what is not so effective is these small interventions that are not really happening on a large scale, but they're also not really informing scale. So it is useful to do things on a small scale if they are explicitly designed to inform what we do on a wider scale. So perhaps we need fewer things that are done not at scale, but also they're not even generating any lessons for government and for wider scale implementation. Just to give you a quick flavor, there are a lot of chapters in this book that we wrote that focus each on different interventions. We categorize them according to various categories, how big the scale was of implementation, whether they had an impact, whether they were measured properly so that we could know what the impact would be. Just to rush through, we had this rubric for assessing the quality of all these interventions, and we rated each intervention, gave them an overall score on the basis of all those different criteria. To rush through it, we have this graph which compares the overall score on the horizontal axis to the measure of scale on the vertical axis. So there's this relationship between the scale at which an intervention happened and the overall kind of quality, the intensity, the level of support, and the impact of these interventions. And what's interesting is that you have three categories of interventions here. You have your light grey dots, the small dots, which were things that were done on a large scale, like the DBE workbooks, but they had very low levels of support, or they weren't measured, the impact was unknown because there was no evaluation, those kinds of interventions. On the other hand, you've got relatively small scale interventions, the dark green dots, where we do have very good evaluations, we know the impact, they had a positive impact on reading outcomes, they had a high level of support, but the problem is they were at a low scale. So the big trick is going to be how do we get the lessons from those relatively small scale ones into the large scale intervention. and move from what works to what scales. Just a few other overall lessons as we surveyed the literature and 10 years worth of interventions on reading. Here are a few lessons. Firstly, we do now have good evidence that structured learning programs which use lesson plans, integrated reading materials, and professional support, especially if there's on-site coaching, those programs really do have a significant impact on reading. Lesson number one. Lesson number two is that the specific pedagogical design features of materials or of training really matters. So one has to pay attention to exactly what is in the books or what is in the training sessions. Important. The third one is that all the successful interventions provide substantial materials. More materials than is normally present in classrooms. So materials have a very key role to play. The fourth lesson is that we concluded that only the DBE workbook program, of all those interventions, only the DBE workbook program is likely to have already had systemic impact. Other interventions, even if they were done in 1,000 schools or 2,000 schools, were done in a subsection of the system and for a temporary period of time. But what we need is these kinds of system-wide interventions that are sustained over time and start to influence the overall patterns of classroom practice. A fifth lesson is that the most informative interventions were designed upfront to be able to measure the impact on reading outcomes. And you have to design quite carefully upfront, otherwise you won't be able to know whether it had an impact on the learning outcomes. What's also important to know is that those interventions had a very robust quantitative design to be able to measure the impact of the program, but they also had qualitative methods to understand how the program worked and why things worked the way they did. Lesson number 6 that we found is that we've got more robust impact evaluation work that's been done around reading than around maths. So the focus today is on reading, and that does mean we now have quite a good evidence base to build on. In the case of maths, by the way, there's work to be done. We need to understand better what works. And the last lesson, which is a bit of an unfortunate lesson, is that when we measure the effects of these interventions well, when we carefully measure them, often the effect sizes are quite small or moderate. And it's when people present results based on a bit of a dodgy method of analysis that they claim big results. But generally speaking, the ones that use robust impact evaluation methods tended to find fairly small impact. And I think what that means is that change is going to take time, it's going to take substantial investment, it's going to take good theories of change in our interventions. It's not going to be a quick fix. Let me skip that for now. You know, let me say this. I think one person, like Pritchard, who is an international expert around education and development around the world, he argues that you need 3 things for success when it comes to these kinds of education programs. The first thing is that the program needs to work. It needs to have a design itself that works. But secondly, you have to have the organizational capacity to implement that program. So you could have a program that really works if well implemented, but there isn't the capacity in the system to implement that program. It's not going to be a good program then. And the third thing is that there needs to be political support for it. And that includes cost. And so in a financially constrained environment, obviously lower cost interventions are going to be more likely to have political support. But you need all those 3 things in place, you're going to have successful program support. And I think looking at South African education over the last 25 or so years, unfortunately I think we've already done many of the things that we can easily scale up. You know, we've done equalizing of funding policies, we've expanded the school feeding program to a large extent, we've rolled out the Grade R program. Access to schooling is really high. You know, we may have a problem of dropping out towards the end of school, but virtually all children enter school and proceed towards the end of primary school. So the challenge now is to improve classroom practice. And that's quite a lot harder than getting children into school or providing meals at school. we're providing things like transport. Those things, perhaps there's room for improvement, but the big challenge is classroom practice, teaching practice, and it's a lot harder to shift that. But that's the challenge we have to start confronting, and it's one which I'm glad to see the reading strategy really is tackling head on. I think this is frozen, perhaps. I think it went a few ahead now. Okay, one of the reasons, I'm not sure if I'm ahead. Did you shift it? Okay, this thing might have, okay, so I'll let you keep shifting then. So one of the reasons why changing classroom practice is so hard is because getting support to the classroom requires people to go there, and subject advisors are one layer in the system where classroom support could be available, but the reality is there's just not enough subject advisors relative to teachers. It varies quite a lot across provinces, as you can see in the graph. At the extreme side, in KZN, we see a ratio of about 1,547 teachers in the foundation phase per foundation phase subject advisor. So those teachers, they don't get the kind of support from the subject advisor that they need to start shifting classroom practice, and that we've seen is effective in some of the coaching interventions. As a result, we see when we ask teachers how often do you receive a visit from a subject advisor across a year, we see in some of the provinces, most of the time teachers say no visits. Often they say one visit, but very few teachers say 4 times in a year or more than 4 times in a year. And so this leads to the issue that we have to deal with. We're all looking for a low-cost intervention that also has high impact. We all want that. And a lot of the evaluations that have been done, things like the early grade reading study, even the Fundo one-day interventions that have been done, including in the Eastern Cape, generally they have an impact, but they come at a fair cost. And so I feel like when presenting those kinds of results in many audiences, half of the room says it's too expensive, and the other half of the room says the impact is still too small compared to the glaring inequalities we have in reading outcomes. And it's very, very difficult to find a sweet spot where it has a high impact and it comes at a low cost and it's easy to implement. But I think we have to wrestle with that reality now, and we have to do more to try to get to impact, even if it is going to come at a relative cost, and it's going to take quite a lot of leadership and planning and logistics to coordinate. It's not just cost, it's also ease of implementation, because implementing a reading strategy takes a lot of coordination. There are a lot of stakeholders, or rather role players, who need to be involved and pulled together. So it's what's low cost but easy to implement, and ultimately this translates into this discussion about what scales. And it might be that the sort of easy things, low cost things are easier to scale up, but what works is the high impact stuff. And we need to try to get closer to an overlap. And I think it's going to take quite a lot of hard work and investment. So where to from here? This is based on a review of what works and looking back at the last 10 years, but what if we look ahead? What needs to happen now in terms of interventions? The first, I've got 3 recommendations to make. The first is that I think we need to avoid what sometimes people refer to as intervention fatigue. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about here, where there are a lot of different interventions going on. The teachers, firstly, get fatigued because they start to feel like, okay, well, this year was this intervention, but next year will be a different one. I think the provincial departments can sometimes also start to rely on these external forms of support rather than implementing more systemic reforms over time. So I think we need if we're going to do small-scale interventions, they need to be done in a way that informs scale. They need to be very research-orientated, very learning-driven, so that they inform what we do on a wider scale. So that's the first recommendation. Let's be careful of lots of little interventions that don't actually contribute to the bigger picture. The second recommendation is that we do need better research and evaluation on something. So it's okay to do things on a small scale, but let's do them in a way that really contributes to the knowledge base. that actually inform scale. And I think we need to do this focusing on some of the very key areas. ECD, the quality of ECD is a big one. Numeracy as well, remedial approaches in grades 4 to 9. We'll hear in the next presentation, I think, about some of the learning losses that happened during the pandemic. I think initial teacher education is a big opportunity, especially given that we are expecting a wave of teacher retirements in the years to come. So aside from reading, those are some key areas in the system. And we need to use better evaluation methods. I think as government departments, we should insist on when evaluations are done, or when interventions are done, that there must be evaluation accompanying that so that we get the lessons from those interventions. The third recommendation then is that we do need to return to a South African tradition of sustained system-wide reforms rather than piecemeal pockets of interventions. And I say return to a South African tradition because I think that is what led to some success over the last 25 years. It's interventions like the DB workbooks, like the school feeding program, like the no-fee policy, like the funding reforms, big interventions, big shifts that have borne fruits, and there's a long way to go, but we've done a number of those very bold interventions that are widely regarded as successful. The workbook intervention is a good example. And we need maybe a new round of those kinds of interventions. And when it comes to reading, the good news is we do not have quite a base of evidence. So we've done small-scale impact evaluations. We now know that the structured learning program of lesson plans, reading materials, and especially good quality professional support, like direct support to teachers, that can have a big impact. We also could further explore the use of teaching assistants or educator assistants, especially given that there is quite a lot of momentum behind that initiative now with the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. The trick now is to use those education assistants in ways that not only give them employment, but that also improve learning. And there are ways that program can be tweaked to strengthen the impact on learning. Lastly, I think what we need to do is we need to complement all these forms of support to the classroom and to teachers with a focus on the right learning outcomes. And in the next presentation from my colleague Bumi, she's going to speak partly about reading benchmarks and all the African languages that as the National Department would be leading the development of. And I think that provides a good opportunity to focus the attention of everyone on what levels of reading do children need to be at in grade 1, in grade 2, in grade 3, in grade 4. Because if everyone's focus is on the right things, it creates more appetite for the intervention support, more take-up of available forms of support. It's also a low-cost thing to do. Getting attention on learning outcomes, trying to make people care more about reading outcomes, that in itself is not a high-cost thing. And it can just add strength to the existing forms of support, some of which do cost quite a bit of money. So that is it. Let me end by saying congratulations on the launch of the strategy. I think it's an exciting development. I really do want to compliment the province on this step. I think it's a great example that we'll be also talking about back in the National Department.